Abuser sells his wife to a humiliating boss, but John is not blind is an unbelievable story of truth. The rain poured relentlessly that night, its rhythm like a countdown, each drop signaling a deeper fall into despair. Inside the dimly lit apartment, Sarah's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of the couch, clutching her phone. She had just overheard something that would forever change the course of her life. Tom, her husband, once the man she thought she loved, now her tormentor, had struck a deal. A deal so monstrous, so vile, that Sarah could hardly comprehend it at first. Her pulse raced as she replayed the words in her mind. "Mr. Harris will take you for a few days," Tom had said, his voice flat and cold. "In exchange, I get the promotion I've been working for. You're not going to ruin this for me, are you?" Her body went numb. He was selling her, the thought was unbearable. Mr. Harris, Tom's ruthless boss, had always treated her like an object, his eyes lingering a little too long, his comments cutting deeper than they appeared. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Tom had agreed to let his boss borrow her. She was nothing more than a tool, a prize to be used to guarantee Tom's advancement. As Sarah sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, she heard the door creak open. Tom's footsteps echoed through the apartment, and she quickly wiped the tears from her cheeks, forcing herself to compose. "Are you ready?" Tom asked with a smirk, his eyes cold, as if he had already won. "Mr. Harris is expecting you. You'd better not disappoint him." Sarah stood up slowly, her mind racing, her thoughts a blur of terror. She couldn't escape. She couldn't even speak. What could she do? Tom had complete control. He knew every move she would make. Or so he thought. But what Tom didn't know was that someone had been watching. Someone who had seen the bruises on her arms, the haunted look in her eyes. Someone who was finally willing to do something about it. Across the hall, John, a former police officer with a heart too pure for the world around him, had witnessed Tom's cruelty over time. He'd seen the signs, the quiet pleas for help, and the way Sarah seemed to disappear further into herself each day. John had always been the silent observer until tonight. He had heard the sharp tones of Tom's voice, followed by Sarah's choked sobs. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It was time to act. Time to save Sarah before it was too late. The next morning, Sarah was sitting in the back of a car, her hands tied in front of her, her heart racing with dread. Mr. Harris's mansion loomed ahead, a place that reeked of power and control. Tom had promised her it would be only a few days. Asterisk, just a few days, asterisk. But Sarah knew better. When the car stopped, Sarah was ushered out by two of Mr. Harris's men. She looked around nervously, feeling the walls of her world close in. This was the moment. Would she survive this? Inside the mansion, the air was thick with tension. The dimly lit halls were filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of footsteps. Sarah could hear Mr. Harris's voice from down the corridor, deep, cold, and calculated. She felt a knot form in her stomach. But what terrified her the most was the thought that she was completely alone. And yet, as the door creaked open, Sarah noticed something strange. John was standing in the shadows, watching from a distance. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, and in that brief connection, Sarah saw something she hadn't dared hope for. Asterisk hope star. The moment Sarah stepped into the room, she was met with Mr. Harris's predatory grin. He sat behind his grand desk, exuding power and control, as if he had orchestrated this entire situation. He stood up slowly, his eyes roaming over Sarah with a mix of hunger and amusement. "Well, well," Mr. Harris mused. "I see Tom wasn't exaggerating. You are as beautiful as he promised. This will be fun." But before Sarah could even react, the door slammed open. John stormed into the room, a wild look in his eyes. "Get away from her," he shouted, his voice filled with a raw intensity that sent a ripple of shock through the room. Mr. Harris's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained composure. "And who exactly are you?" he sneered. "I'm someone who isn't blind," John said, stepping forward, his eyes never leaving Mr. Harris. Someone who won't let you use her, not without consequences. John had already contacted his old colleagues in the police department. This wasn't just about rescuing Sarah anymore. It was about exposing the corrupt world Mr. Harris had built for himself. Within moments, officers flooded the room, arresting Mr. Harris and his men. The walls of power, so carefully constructed, were crumbling, and all that remained was the truth. Sarah stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She had expected this moment to be filled with fear. But instead, there was something else: relief. And gratitude. She turned to John, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why did you help me?" John's gaze softened, and he walked over to her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. "Because no one deserves to be treated like that. And because I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer any longer." Days later, Tom was arrested for his involvement in the deal with Mr. Harris. The investigation revealed the extent of his cruelty, and Sarah's testimony was the final blow that exposed him for what he truly was. As for Mr. Harris, his empire of corruption crumbled, and his name became synonymous with scandal. He would never have power over anyone again. But for Sarah, the real victory was finding her strength. She had survived the worst, and now she was free. Free to rebuild her life, to reclaim her dignity, and to finally live without fear. John became more than just a neighbor. He became her protector, her closest friend. And while their relationship started with an act of courage, it soon bloomed into something deeper, something beautiful and real. They were no longer strangers. They were each other's safe haven. As Sarah looked out the window one evening, the sun setting in the distance, she realized something she hadn't known before. Even in the darkest moments, there was always a way out. Sometimes, it just took someone who refused to look away. And John had never been blind.